Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you for joining us for this last day of the first week of the CNI virtual fall 2020 member meeting. I'm the director of CNI, Cliff Lynch, and I'll be introducing this rather briefly. A couple of logistical things. This is being recorded and we will be making this session publicly available later. There is closed captioning available if you'd like to turn it on. We do have a chat stream available, and please feel free to use the chat stream for comments or to introduce yourself as the session goes on. There's also a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. We'll hold all the questions till the end, at which point Diane Goldenberg-Hart will materialize to moderate the question and answer session. But please feel free to ask questions at any point as they occur to you. I think that's everything in terms of logistical stuff. So let me just introduce the session. We have with us Paul Bracke from Gonzaga, and also Jean McManus from the University of Notre Dame. The presentation today, I think, is going to be quite interesting. It deals with the development of a Catholic news archive. There are a number of efforts that I am aware of to capture various collections of often smaller newspapers that were in distribution around America for many, many years. And they tend to be really fascinating because they map into all kinds of immigrant communities and ethnic communities and things of that nature, and really give us a wonderful set of insights into parts of the history of this country that aren't well known. So I think this will be a very interesting presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to it. With that, let me just hand it off to Paul and say, Jean and Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Cliff. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. So I'm Paul Bracke, Dean of the Foley Library at Gonzaga University, and I'm also a member of the board of the Catholic Research Resources Alliance, which is really the sponsoring organization of the Catholic News Archive. And my co-presenter is Jean McManus, a librarian for Catholic Studies and Archives Engagement at the University of Notre Dame. And we're really excited today to be able to share the work of the CRRA, the Catholic Research Resources Alliance, with you today on the Catholic News Archive. And we'd also be remiss without acknowledging the contributions of Jennifer Younger, Executive Director of CRRA, for her contributions in developing the presentation. So we're just going to start by providing an overview of the initiative and the project, move into a discussion of the research value of the collections, and then move into a brief discussion of some of what we think are maybe some of the most pressing directions for future activities for the group. So just to start with a little bit of background, the Catholic News Archive is a program of the Catholic Research Resources Alliance, CRRA, as I'd mentioned. CRRA is an independent membership organization that seeks to provide global access to Catholic research resources. And we have about 50 members and partners. Many of these are academic libraries like Notre Dame or Gonzaga, Marquette, University of San Diego, places like that. But our membership also includes other sorts of cultural heritage institutions that have other unique contributions to make to our work. So, for example, we have religious congregation and diocesan archives, such as the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, the Catholic Historical Research Center of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and the Daughters of Charity Provincial Archives as some of our members. So the work of CRA is done through a number of programs, including the Catholic Portal, which provides discovery to rare and difficult to locate Catholic research resources from across the Alliance's memberships. But really, the one major initiative that we're here to share today is the Catholic News Archive. So just to give you some context for the archive itself, the Catholic News Archive is a digital collection of North American Catholic newspapers that is freely available to users and currently consists of about 500,000 digitized pages from 17 newspapers. And these papers cover a range of dates, geography, and communities. Jean's going to discuss the research value of the collections in a little bit, but just to give you a few examples of some of the interesting newspapers that we have in the collection. As a native St. Louisan, I had to pick out the Shepherd of the Valley, which is the first newspaper of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, which was published in their 1830s and was an English and French language newspaper. Another interesting one is the Catholic Worker, a newspaper started by Dorothy Day. And one that I'm also drawn to is La Esperanza, which was a national Catholic Spanish language newspaper in Los Angeles, published from the late 20s through the 50s. And it focused on Catholic topics related to the US Spanish-speaking population, with a particular focus on the Mexican American community, and it had a unique transnational perspective. So within the archive, scanning and conversion meter exceed the standards of the National Digital Newspaper Program, with article and page level indexing done with Metz Alto, again, widely used for newspaper digitization projects around the world. Our platform that we use is Veridian. It's a company based in New Zealand. It provides a mobile-friendly platform, again, used by many newspaper digitization projects, including like the State Library and National Library even projects. Oops. So here's a screenshot so that you can just get a feel for what it looks like. So what I'd like to discuss now is just a little bit is really how we've gotten to the point where we have the archive that we have. So the Catholic Newspaper Archive has been developed with a set of development and partnership strategies to guide the effort. I'll start with some of the development priorities. So you can see a number of these on the slide, but there are just a couple that I'd like to particularly highlight. First, really just a fundamental principle for us is that we've really been wanting to design this archive with concern for functionality and access for researchers. We acknowledge that there are other uses, which we would encourage, but the use by researchers has really been primary in the development of the archive. Second thing is that a goal of the archive is to provide long-term barrier-free access to the collection, but in the interest of the newspaper publishers who are our partners, it also reserves rights for commercial use to those newspaper publishers. And finally, I think, and this is something that I think is really incredibly important about the Catholic Newspaper Archive, but also CRA's work in general, is that a goal of the project has been to allow the participation of a wide range of participants in the project in a variety of roles. And this includes participation from small academic libraries who might not otherwise have the resources or opportunity to participate in large-scale digitization projects, but also as our membership list may indicate, also other types of institutions that might not always be included as partners with academic libraries in these sorts of projects. And with the Catholic News Archive in particular, some examples of these would be our many diocesan archive partners, the Catholic Communication Campaign of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and also a community of women religious. So, partnerships are really incredibly important to us in our work. And we've engaged in in a number of activities to develop these partnerships on different levels. First, as I mentioned in the previous slide, one of our goals is one of our key partners is would be our newspaper publishers. Without permissions and their partnership, this archive couldn't exist. And one thing that we found interesting is that openness has really been a selling point to those partners for whom a primary concern is really expanding their communities of readers, as well as there's also an interest in contributing to scholarly communication, the scholarly community writ large. And we were able to partner with them in a manner that allows for open distribution of their publications while also reserving the rights for them to engage in some commercial reuse as they wish. So for example, there might be digitization of sacramental records that would be listed in newspapers through commercial sources. And so I think that a key point that Jennifer Younger always makes is that for our publishers, it's participation. The decision to participate with the Catholic News Archive versus commercial outfits is not necessarily an either-or proposition for them. There's an extent to which they can do both, and in fact, some of our partners have been able to leverage their commercial digitization activities to be able to contribute scans of their work to the News Archive. Second layer is we really need to develop partnerships with a variety of libraries and archives to secure access of copies for digitization. These are materials where there are very few large collections of Catholic newspapers, where even libraries that collect them may have limited retention policies. And so these are really not just hidden collections, but they're really widely scattered collections as well. And that's where it's really been particularly important for us to be able to work with institutions like diocesan archives who hold so many of these scattered resources. And finally, the third thing is that we've really worked and developed great partnerships regarding governance. Right? So we've really been engaged not only within CRA, but also in engaging scholars and our publishing partners in helping to make policy and strategic direction decisions for the archives. And these partnerships have also carried over into our funding. So we've done cooperative funding of pilot projects, of contributing. We've done cooperative funding through CRRA for funding some of the ongoing hosting costs, but also worked with our members and with other partners on securing grant funds to launch, to digitize additional content. So with that, I'll hand things over to Jean to discuss the research value of the collections within the archive.
Thanks, Paul. So we've listed on this slide some of the themes and more prominent names that that researchers have used the Catholic News Archive to mine. And we've, even with our current corpus of 17 titles, we can really show change over time in Catholic reporting, Catholic topics of interest to Catholics nationwide, really from the 1830s all the way into the 21st century, although that's not any more additions that we can make that will add to the ability to turn up the Catholic perspective. On this slide, we've got images of Columbus monuments, a European one, and then on the right is Columbus behind a fence it's actually a local statue that is under consideration for either contextualizing or possible removal or something like that. But Columbus is kind of a useful figure to highlight here because that's something that the Catholic News Archive can do is give access to thoughts on things like monuments and what themes were important. The archive turns up more than 2,000 references to Christopher Columbus, and that shows the 19th century Catholic enthusiasm for for Columbus as a Catholic hero. And then, but there's also toward the later end of the whole archive, you see information about, the controversies associated with Columbus. we've also got streams that document um, Indian schools, Native Americans, Catholicism among smaller groups, Black Catholicism. So all of these things are things that we want to add to the collection in order to get at some of these more perhaps niche communities. And with increased attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, that will certainly shape the way that we seek titles to add to the collection going. But for now, we're thinking about what out from the national newspapers that are already included, and what kind of diversity can we present in terms of language, like La Esperanza, the early French language portions of some of the newspapers. And we're considering things like, can we highlight one of the first Black Catholic newspapers actually published in Detroit in the 1880s and 90s, the American Catholic Tribune, published by Daniel Rudd, born a slave in Kentucky. And then we also have access to collections like the Catholic Sioux Herald, which was also published in the 19th century by one of those, an Indian school and mission in South Dakota. So these are the directions that will go in to increase the access to these kind of themes. We can go to the next slide, which is again a screenshot of the Catholic News Archive showing our content for Columbus. Columbus on its own as a keyword pulls up everything from our Ohio cities and other places, and the Knights of Columbus, etc. But you'll note in the tiny text in the bottom corner, we've got facets that show the coverage just in that portion of the screen. 1839, we've got 63 references to Christopher Columbus. So for certain topics, this is going to be a really rich resource. As we add to it, even more of a rich resource. You can go to the next slide, Paul. The Catholic News Archive, with all of the members and partners, is proving already to be useful in managing our collections. We do have a lot of diocesan and academic Catholic libraries included in our membership, and no one of us, no even coalition of us can digitize all of the relevant resources, but collectively we're seeing that we can really leverage this for our own purposes and for that greater good that Paul mentioned at the beginning. We are governed by members of the CRRA, and in consultation with scholars, with all of the partners, each institution is able to put forward for prioritization titles that they're interested in, titles that might be relevant to their local community. And scholars who we've convened from around the country, a lot of historians, unsurprisingly, have a great deal of interest in surfacing this kind of these kind of resources. And so there's a vibrant conversation about what things to include and how to go forward. And then libraries can rally around, and archives as well, to support the digitization of particular titles. And we did start with an eye toward digitizing the quote unquote Vatican II years of particular newspapers, because that is an area of great interest. And it's true that these newspapers that we've selected are ones that are often not included in larger commercial collections, newspaper databases, or even in some of the efforts we've seen, like Chronicling America from the Library of Congress. There are only a handful and only partial representation of Catholic newspapers. So we do feel like we're contributing to that larger open access material that's out there. So the digitization and digital preservation go hand in hand as things are put forward for digitization, and that's been by particular members seeking grants, but then orienting their digitization efforts toward inclusion in the Catholic News Archive. We've seen real success with that, and because the standards for the platform are consistent, it gives everyone an ongoing access to these resources. And we have been very happy to use this in a couple of instances where we, as a library, we can provide financial support along with others to the digitization and the hosting example of that, where we have contributed financially, but the digitization, the quality control, the hosting is done in a centralized way through the Catholic News Archive, and that is a beautiful thing. We don't have to, in our home institutions, we don't have to be concerned about that. We do it collectively. So the image on this page is of the American newsstand. I don't have actual details about where this is, but and that's a bit of a gesture toward the kind of diversity we'd like to include in the future, where we would like to explore digitizing German American Catholic newspapers, of which there were a robust number from the late 19th century into the early to mid 20th century. Pretty much an undiscovered, or little used because it's microfilm and also in German language, but a resource that could contribute to that larger, greater good. So we're on to the next slide, I believe, Paul.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up just very briefly with just some brief remarks about a couple of our future directions, and then we should have a few minutes yet for questions. So, as far as we've come with the archive, there's always more to do, and the main thing I'd like to leave you with on this is that we're always trying to make sure that we make this as useful to scholars as possible. And so there are a number of features that we're trying to do, ranging from, adding additional content to things like, making it easier to do text mining or do bulk downloading of content from the archive. But one of the things that we'd really like to invite both those of you who are in the audience today, but also those of you who might be watching this after the fact to do, is to give us some feedback on what might be particularly useful to you, either in terms of content or in terms of functionality. And so there's a survey link here that we'd really appreciate it if you could give us some input on. And then the other thing, and just to reiterate a point that Jean made in her remarks, is that we are really very interested in expanding inclusion within the collection and making sure that the wide range of voices that are part of the Catholic community in North America are represented within the Catholic News Archives. So with that, that's our presentation, and we'll open it for questions.
Thank you, Paul and Jean, for that really interesting presentation on that wonderful resource. We appreciate you coming to CNI to talk to us about that. And thanks to our attendees for joining us here this afternoon, if you're on the East Coast. And I'd like to open up the floor now for questions or comments relating to this topic. So please go ahead and type your questions now into the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to share those with our presenters. And while we are waiting for folks to mull over what they've just heard, I just was wondering, I realized this resource is a North American resource. Are there any thoughts about going international with this?
You know, there have not, I think that there's been some interest. So, you know, Jennifer Younger, for example, has indicated that there might be some interest in thinking about other, you know, really, we say North American, but really what's in the archive is US newspapers at this point. And so I think that there's interest in looking at Canada and Mexico and in the Caribbean for certainly. Beyond that, I'm not so sure.
Okay, got it. And about how many newspapers are in it right now?
Yeah, so right now it's 17 newspapers. And as I mentioned, those are from, you know, those represent, you know, much of the geography of the US. They represent different time periods from, you know, the early 19th century through the 20th century. You know, some of those are national newspapers, the Catholic Worker, for example, which is a major socialist newspaper. And it looks like Jennifer's jumped in here too.
Yes, I just turned on Jennifer's microphone. So Jennifer, I see you made a comment in the chat, but please feel free to share that comment with us if you'd like. I'll just read that aloud. And so Jennifer, if she wants to join in, please do. Jennifer writes, yes, we know there's interest among French, Chilean, and other Latin American countries. Money is the only obstacle. Canada papers are on the agenda now. Okay, so you were asking me to share that. Okay, got it, no problem. If you want to jump in, please feel free to do so at any time.
I will comment that the Catholic News Service newsfeed, which is digitized and fully in the Catholic News Archive, is interesting in that that includes, say, dispatches from Rome and the like. So there's it is a news service, and so there's it serves as in a way a bit of an index to national and also to a certain extent international Catholic news. So that's been a very interesting addition to the roster of newspapers. And also the Catholic News and Pictures is very popular, and we've found uses for this with a number of different audiences. Of course, researchers and college students are among the big users as far as I'm concerned and as far as I observe, but also with younger students. We've had interest from high schools in the area around our institution, and we've had some pretty good success with pushing it out to people. The more visual, the better in some cases for our younger researchers.
Yeah, that's great to hear. We have a question coming in now from Nathan Girth. Nathan asks, first he comments, it's great to see these materials being captured with so many participating organizations. Can you talk about how you handle the challenges of governance?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a number of we have several governance bodies within that work with the project. You know, there's overall management of anything CRA happens at the board of the parent organization. But there's also a newspapers project committee that is part of that is specific to CNA. I can't remember, Jean, if you're on that. There's a scholars committee that where we work with faculty and historians and such who might want to use that to get feedback from that perspective. And then there's also a group of the publishing partners that we work with. And really, when I say we, that's really the executive director doing a lot of that work.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And thanks, Nathan, for that question. We also have another comment from Jennifer relating back to the question from before. And she says 85% of use comes from the US. The remainder comes from the UK, European countries, African countries, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So that's not an insignificant amount of international interest in the tool.
Mhm.
Really interesting. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in right now, and we are actually at time. So I'll go ahead and bring the public portion of this presentation to a close by stopping the recording, but I'll invite our attendees who are still here. If you are interested in hanging around, we can unmute you. You can approach the podium and have a chat with our presenters, make comments, ask questions as you like. So once again, thank you so much, Paul and Jean, for coming to CNI and sharing your project with us. It was really a pleasure to hear about. And thank you to all of our attendees. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.